From 2003 Media, I'm Campbell Barron, and this is The Ones Who Succeed. Welcome to the program. Hello.
Hello. How's it going?
Oh my God. I gotta say, Gary, I think you have the crispiest Zoom setup in all of Silicon Valley.
Oh, it's worth it. If you spend all the time in Zoom these days, then that's the best way to do it.
I really appreciate your time.
Oh, thanks for having me. I mean, I was listening to your a few of your other things, so it's so cool that you're doing this.
I appreciate it. I'm a big fan. I've respected your work for a while. Today on the show, I'm thrilled to have a conversation with Garry Tan. Garry is someone who I have personally admired for quite a while now for many reasons. From the macro, Garry is a venture capitalist, having co-founded Initialized Capital alongside Reddit Co-Founder Alexis Ohanian. Initialized is an early-stage venture fund, which today has a portfolio worth over $40 billion with past investments in Instacart, Coinbase, and Cruise, to name a few. However, what also interests me is a decision Garry made about a year ago to start creating content and build up his personal brand. This fueled by the inception of his YouTube channel, a decision that, as you will hear, was inspired by none other than YouTube luminary Casey Neistat. Today, Garry has found his stride on YouTube, amassing an audience of over 40,000 subscribers. And while that's not really unheard of in today's day and age, having a personal brand on the rise has and will continue to result in more investment opportunities and deal flow for Initialized Capital. As a result, Garry, based in San Francisco, joined this program via Zoom to discuss his entry point into the world of startups, life as a venture capitalist with a portfolio worth over $40 billion, and of course, the power of a personal brand in 2020. That's all coming up. This is The Ones Who Succeed. I'm Campbell Barron. My conversation with Garry Tan starts now. If you can briefly introduce yourself, who are you and what do you do?
Yeah, absolutely. My name's Garry Tan. I'm a venture capitalist today, but I started off my career as a software engineer. I worked at Microsoft at a big company. I turned down the shot to be one of the co-founding engineers at Palantir, and I ended up joining as employee number 10. Then I left to apply to Y Combinator and got in with a company called Posterous. At the time, big competitor to Tumblr. I know you had Matt from Tumblr previously on the show. So it was really cool to hear about his perspectives. And yeah, you just run across all the same people in tech sooner or later, which is interesting. And then it was his co-founder for Beam, Casey Neistat, that taught me to just give it a shot.
And this is YouTube.
Yeah. I saw what he had built, and I realized I could get a direct connection to people. I already had a big Twitter following from running Posterous, which itself was a social network, but I think a lot of it was just very, very accidental. But run a venture capital fund with about $770 million under management, spent 5 years as a partner at Y Combinator, funding thousands of companies and working with them very closely. So I love the super early stage.
So a lot to get at there.
Oh, yeah.
I will say one thing you mentioned, which is in Silicon Valley or in the world of tech, networks just intertwine, which is totally true. And you never know who you meet and what they might do. And so I think that's, at least from my perspective, as someone who kind of trying to break into this world, that's the exciting part. But that's really interesting that you mentioned Casey as an inspiration in regards to your motivation to become a creator, if you will. And I've talked with Matt about this, that Casey's following and him as a creator really helped Beam as a company. And so I take it that you see you being a creator as a potential benefit or as a direct benefit for Initialized and the companies you fund.
Yeah.
And I want to get into that. But quickly, if you can walk me through your entry point into the world of tech, I'd like to understand a little bit of your beginnings here.
Oh, absolutely. Well, I guess it started when my dad brought home a IBM PC XT. I think computers always were just a refuge, a part of my life. And then as I went into junior high, I got very obsessed with this idea of creating media for myself. And so, 7th grade, ended up learning how to make newspapers in PageMaker, and I'd get all of my friends to write stories as if they were newspaper reporters, or it could be a review of a movie they liked. And it was just totally for fun. It was sort of proto-blogging in a way. And I liked that here I was, the short, skinny, nerdy kid with big glasses. But, I walked around and everyone knew me because they knew me from the newspaper itself. So it's funny because I guess that just continues, Media is useful, valuable, and it's also powerful. And then once I learned how to make web pages from that, I didn't grow up with a lot of money. My parents were first-generation immigrants. They didn't speak English well. So we lived in apartments. We lived in 1- and 2-bedroom apartments with me and my brother. And one day I realized I could probably get a job. And I opened up the Yellow Pages back when there were Yellow Pages to the internet section. And I just picked up the phone and started calling until I got a job for $7 an hour. And I made a couple grand and put that towards the home that my parents ended up buying when I was a teenager. And I think at that point, I was hooked. We were in the first city in the United States that had cable modems. So before that, you really had to struggle with your modem, and it was very slow bandwidth. And I learned how to, run my own Linux servers and learn to code. I, again, cold emailed my way into one of the first digital agencies called, funny enough, Adjacency. And that firm actually made the first Apple e-commerce store. And so, my mentor from that was the CEO, and he himself had cold mailed like several hundred top CMOs and brands that he wanted to work with. And that's how he got his first customers for his ad agency. So I don't know. It's interesting to think cold emails and cold messages got basically a lot of people, a lot of things. And I think that still continues to today. A really well-crafted cold email can bring people really, really far away in society.
Got you on this podcast, Garry. Well, I guess a cold DM. When I started this podcast a couple of years ago, I knew 0 people in tech. I literally didn't know a soul. And just, after hundreds and hundreds of cold emails, eventually you can get people to say yes. And so I think I will say cold mail sounds a lot worse though. That sounds like it stretches the process out. And I think that's extremely admirable that you contributed and helped out your family. And I really think one's origin story and having that work ethic at a young age does go on to influence what a person does later on in life. And that's clearly an example of that. So you mentioned the power of content. And so it seems like at a young age, you were interested in tech, and you also saw the value of content. And the reason I mentioned those two is because one of the startups you eventually co-founded was a Tumblr competitor called Posterous. And I bring this up. You also started a company called Posthaven before that. But I bring this up because it seems like today with your content, but also just interviews, etc. on Twitter, you seem to reference your experience with those two startups quite frequently. And I bring that up because as a VC today who has had operating experience, how important do you think it is that you have had operating experience?
I think it helps, but there's definitely lots of really amazing examples of VCs who never had operating experience. And I think the way they got there is just by having the same number of reps that I ended up getting at Y Combinator. Anyone who spends enough time with enough founders and sees all of the landmines, I think investors cannot really tell you what way to truly go. The founder really needs to figure that out for themselves because they're living that. The best an investor can really do is sort of steer you clear of the 1,000 landmines. And at this point, I think I've seen, I don't know, maybe 10% of the landmines, and that's probably enough to be helpful and be useful. And that's the best you can hope for. I don't think it's required, but it certainly helps for someone to have been in the shoes of a founder. And it truly is, as Elon Musk says, sometimes eating glass and staring into the abyss of death. It sounds very melodramatic, but you put all of your heart and soul and your capital and, your self-worth often into a startup. And to have someone who's able to understand that and then give that the proper reverence it deserves, I think that's important, whether someone has operating experience as an investor or not. The best people get that no matter what.
Mm-hmm. How do you differentiate what makes, on that note, what makes a fantastic entrepreneur versus a fantastic venture investor? Because while if you're in the startup community, they kind of seems like, separate sides of the aisle, if you will. It seems like there are many shared character traits, and a venture firm on its own is a company. It is a startup of startups, if you will. And yeah, that has its own mandate and with highs and lows, etc. So what do you see as a big differentiator in character in regards to kind of the entrepreneur versus the investor?
Well, the investor has a portfolio and the founder has a portfolio of one. So at the end of the day, I have great respect for that sovereignty, that risk taking, right? And that's why I think the relationship between the investor and the founder is pretty important. And I think it's evolved. There are new investors, new styles, new people coming up who are hungry. And the funniest thing that drives that is actually venture investors over time who are good. They actually just make too much money, and it takes 10, 15 years. And that's the interesting thing. There's always something new. And if you ask me, what does it take to be a good venture investor today? I think it's honestly being a great listener, being very empathetic, and then having a crazy amount of access to capital. That's it. I don't think there's very much beyond that, actually.
Mm-hmm. So a few things here. You, like I mentioned, were an entrepreneur. You're a VC now, but you also mentioned something which is really interesting, which you had a YouTube video on this, but I would like to kind of go over this, which was, you often hear about the near misses in someone's career.
Yeah.
And in your case, you mentioned an opportunity at Palantir, which you turned down. The reason I want to highlight this is because I think it's really important because you're doing all right now. And this kind of shows that there's not just one, opportunity. And while that probably would have been quite lucrative for you, it's safe to say that you're doing meaningful work you enjoy now. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, we're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back after a brief word from our sponsor. You're listening to The Ones Who Succeed in my conversation with Garry Tan. Welcome back to the program. I'm Campbell Barron. You're doing all right now. And this kind of shows that there's not just one, opportunity. And while that probably would have been quite lucrative for you, it's safe to say that you're doing meaningful work you enjoy now. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was 22 years old, just graduated from Stanford. There were no startups around, so otherwise I would have gone to work for a startup. And so I got on a plane to Redmond and worked for Microsoft. And friends of mine about a year in called me and said, hey, fly back to San Francisco. We're starting a company with Peter Thiel. And I had dinner with Peter. And it was about the time he wrote the $500,000 check to Facebook. And he said, what are you doing at Microsoft? You're wasting your time. You need to quit. And I'm so sure this is the right thing. He asked me how much a year I made, which was $70,000 a year. And he said, I'm going to write you a personal check from my bank account. I'm so sure this is the right thing. Just, quit your job. This is a no risk proposition for you. And I said no, because I might get promoted at Microsoft the next year. And I ended up joining a year later because they had hired away a bunch of our other mutual best friends from college. Got my friend Bob McGrew, who now runs things over at OpenAI. He dropped out of his PhD at Stanford. And I'm like, well, I have a job. But, dropping out of a PhD on CS at Stanford is a bigger deal than that. So I must have made a mistake. And I spent a lot of time thinking why did I say no? And that was literally basically opportunity knocking on my door. And I said no. And I didn't answer because I wasn't thinking independently at that time. TechCrunch didn't exist. Twitter didn't exist back then. But I didn't see what they were doing as something that was hot. And as a result, it didn't hit. My pattern match was given to me by media. So it's funny because it comes full circle, right? Today we create media, we're creating media right now. But the thing to really keep in mind is, what I'm saying to you now and, what I think is hot right at this moment is sort of a second or third hand retelling of things that happened 9 to 12 months ago. And that's the dangerous thing when it comes to being young. And, nobody tells you this. I wish someone told me this when I was much, younger and earlier in my career, which is you need to think first principles. If not this team, then who? Because the co-founders of Palantir were people who I had worked together on projects with, we tried to start companies together before. I knew they were good. And then if not this investor, then who? I knew Peter Thiel. I had him come to speak at Stanford for my entrepreneurship society back then. I knew he was great. And then the thing that really was tough is like they were trying to do enterprise software for the government. And, that didn't enter my world as something that was, hot or interesting, right? Like the people I thought were smart who were like reporters were not talking about it. And I realized, it's funny because that's a part of the debate today, right? Like whose worldview do you want to adopt? And the important thing, if you want to create brand new things, then aren't just like a simulacra of what other people are doing, is you actually have to think from first principles. Like, who are these people? Do I trust them? Do I know they're good? And then what are they doing? And do I know that that is a real problem? And do I believe that they can sell it? And if yes to those things, it doesn't matter that the Wall Street Journal hasn't said anything about it, or my favorite, Twitter, intelligentsia has caught on. Like the important thing to create something new is for it to make sense to you. And if you can make it sense to yourself, and you can make it make sense to other people, like recruiting them, and you can make it make sense to investors by getting their money, then that actually is a self-fulfilling prophecy that can actually happen. And all of that starts with your own individual agency and your own way of making sense of the world, not the one that other people tell you to have.
Mm-hmm. So I want to touch on a few things here in regards to venture, though, and more specifically you, because I actually recently heard your name in an interview. And this interview was about this startup, which you talk about a lot, and rightfully so. It's an interesting company. And this founder sold you via beer that arrived at your house. And this interview was the How I Built This Episode on Instacart.
Oh, yeah.
And I thought that was very, very interesting back in your Y Combinator days. And the reason I bring this up is because I think it's very interesting to show that like that could have been another near miss. And in the early stages, no one really knows. It's difficult. But walk me through your Y Combinator experience, and more specifically Instacart, which that was a company, and just that experience as a whole.
Yeah, absolutely. So I became an investor, but I never had any intention of doing so. Y Combinator gave me my start. I just actually joined part-time to help out with design for homepages. And that just ended up becoming a profession. I joined right at the moment when Y Combinator itself became known for a place for billion-dollar companies to come through. When I first went through, it was a fringe thing that nobody had heard of, and Dropbox happened, but people thought, oh, that's a billion-dollar company that was a fluke. Like this thing doesn't actually mint new startups that really matter. And then, it's funny, it takes 5 or 6 years for people to really figure out that that actually matters. Mm-hmm. So yeah, by 2012, I had become an investing partner, and Apoorva sent email to all of the partners at the time, and everyone gets crazy amounts of cold email. And so it's hard to respond, but I guess I have a special spot for cold email in my heart. So I saw it, and then I said, I saw the email from Apoorva, and I said, well, Y Combinator is half over. It would be almost impossible for you to get in. And, credit to Apoorva, and he has a true sort of founder's mentality. He's like, so you're saying there's a chance. And so he found out the address to Y Combinator. He had hired 2 people off of Craigslist to actually work for Instacart, and he had a driver app and an app that you could use to buy things. And he just used the thing he had already built. And what's funny is I had seen that idea probably dozens of times in that cohort. People had been pitching that idea. Uber was new, so the idea that you could have a mobile workforce was very a la mode. But, in the end, what happened was here was someone who had actually built it. And that was the really cool thing, that I got a 6-pack of beer. I downloaded the app. I tried it. And the next day we funded it, even though Y Combinator was half over. And it's the best company of that whole year for YC to fund. And though, knock on wood, we did fund a lot of good companies that year. And then, went on to raise a Series A from Sequoia and sort of become what it is today.
Fantastic. What an awesome story. I think that's great. And this Y Combinator experience was almost an incubator for yourself. And I think that's also another way to look at it, because you went on to start your own fund with Reddit Co-Founder Alexis Ohanian called Initialized. And since then, that has done quite well. And I am curious in regards to the $1 million, or, if you're lucky, $1 billion question, which is, what is the Initialized secret sauce in regards to funding early stage companies? Because every VC does it different.
Yeah, that's a great question. I can only guess at it. I think off the bat, we just like people who build. So we really like engineers, we like product people, we like designers. And then that's actually what got me about Instacart, and that's what got me about Coinbase when we met that founder, is that both of them had...
Brian.
Brian Armstrong had left Airbnb to start Coinbase, and he had a demo that we could try. It was a website that you could put a credit card into and buy a Bitcoin on. And there's something magical about exactly that moment. If you have a technical founder who, doesn't even need a team yet.
Yeah. You mentioned this at the beginning of the program, but part of the reason I'm really interested in you as a venture capitalist and also creator is the fact that you decided to kind of take your personal brand into your own hands. And so I am curious, and you mentioned Casey Neistat had an influence on this, which if I could pick one person who I wish, got me into YouTube, I think he might be the guy here. But what was the inception in regards to your YouTube journey? Walk me through the whole picture here.
Well, I was always into photography, which is funny. I mean, I think I got Paul Graham and Jessica Livingston at Y Combinator's attention for Posterous by taking photos at startup school. And that trended on Hacker News. And I felt like they needed to give us an interview at the very least. And we got in. So photos and AV, I've always been an AV nerd. I mean, media nerd, period. Like, I just love that stuff. And then I met Casey, he came by Initialized. He hung out at the office for a little bit, and just watching actually our interns. So we had some 18 and 19-year-old college freshman interns, and they walked up to him and started talking to him like they knew him. And it just really made me realize, we live in a very mediated world, even going back to whether or not I should have joined Palantir. I took media for my worldview. And if you combine that with the ability to have a direct impact on people, that's like what I want. What got me into believing that I could even start a company while I was working at Palantir was Paul Graham's essays. And I found out and those essays sung to me because they awakened a part of me that I didn't know existed, which is I could be a founder. And once I became a founder, I realized he was right. Like, what I was doing, working for someone else, that was something that I could do for myself. And functionally, it wasn't different. And the only true difference was I was assuming more of the risk, but I also bore all of the rewards if it worked. So yeah, I think media teaches us who we can be. And then I think that starting companies and making products and services for 1 billion people is the siren song, right? It is the thing that I think is the most high leverage, insane thing that you can do in society today. And I want a lot more of it to happen. And I do actually think from an engineering perspective, we can actually engineer more success by avoiding failure. And so that's why when I talk about things, I talk about them from my own perspective, and I share what actually in the moment are pretty painful failures in my life. Failing to raise money from Benchmark Capital, even though we had outrageous retention and a hockey stick graph. Like, that was one of the stories I talked about recently, and it went viral. And, I think that what I thought was sort of a failing in me, I wear my failure on my sleeve, but now what I realize is that makes me a purple cow. Most people are very afraid to share what they screwed up on, but that's actually what's hidden for me. That's why I think my YouTube channel is working, because I'm not here to brag to you. Like, I'm secure in like my life, and I'm excited. I wake up every morning and I'm excited to be alive. So I don't have anything to prove on that end. What I do want, though, is entrepreneurship and founders and, creators to be more successful and to avoid all of my landmines and all the landmines that I've seen over my career working with founders. And if that can happen, then, what Paul Graham's essays basically created was Y Combinator, which helped create $150 billion worth of startups that wouldn't have existed without that effort. And so if I can even capture like 1/10 or one 1/10 of 1% of that, I mean, it's just insane. I think that we're just getting started on helping people unlock their own personal potential.
Well, I got to say, as a consumer of your content, very unique style, and I really enjoy watching your videos.
Thank you.
And it's nice that, speaking of Y Combinator, that Y Combinator isn't the only kind of YouTube startup creator in the pack.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that's very interesting. Now, this is like probably one of the less important questions, but does Casey Neistat just hang around venture offices? What's the deal there? Coming up, my conversation with Garry Tan continues. We'll be right back after this last break. Stick with us. Welcome back to The Ones Who Succeed. I'm Campbell Barron, and I'm joined by none other than Garry Tan. And so we're going to jump right back into that conversation. Does Casey Neistat just hang around venture offices? What's the deal there?
He was just working on something and wanted some advice, and, we talked through some things. So I'm curious to see what his next thing is, and I can't wait to see it because he's a very special person.
Is he building again? Do you have the inside scoop?
Oh, I wouldn't want to divulge, but I hope he is.
Yeah, I think part of the comparison I can make between you two is just, and I mentioned this earlier, but Beam significantly benefited from Casey's just momentum as a personal brand. And when I was talking to Matt, that was great because instead of focusing on how do we get users, it was kind of focusing on like trying to please users. And that's difficult. That's a difficult task of its own. But
retention is so hard.
I personally think they were onto something. And I think you're starting to see this kind of awareness in regards to the negative sides of social media through films like The Social Dilemma and just also through kind of the general discourse.
What did you think of The Social Dilemma? I'm curious.
I'm fascinated by it. I was very fascinated by it. I think it reassured some of my perspectives I already had. I mean, to be fair, after watching it, Tim Kendall, who is featured in it, who is the former president of Pinterest and then runs Moment now, has agreed to come on the podcast. And so
great. Looking forward to that.
I don't want to have to. I think he's the expert there, so I'm not the expert. But from my perspective, I just think that when you're in kind of a culture or a system where growth at all costs, and there's kind of a small group of people deciding something that affects a large group of people, I think naturally you can stumble into kind of tricky territory. But from a consumer standpoint, I think apps like Moment and just screen time, etc., are fantastic because I try to limit my social media consumption to like no more than 30 minutes a day. And I'm like super strict about that with myself because I could just scroll forever. And so that's kind of my perspective. But, I'm kind of waiting for him to share because my idea is quite limiting. How about you?
Can't wait to listen. Yeah, I think that these systems are amoral. They're amoral, which is not to say they're immoral, right? Media itself it can be a tool for good, a tool for evil. It has been both, and it will be both. And so it's tricky to moralize the mechanism itself. Well, and then on my end, I can control what media I put out in the world, and hopefully it's good. That's
the thing. That's not all content is created equal. And if I'm spending, an hour watching your YouTube channel versus, people falling on their ass, I'd like to think I'm educating myself by watching your YouTube channel.
Also, I don't have anything to sell. I'm not trying to sell anything.
And this is interesting, right? Because you have around 30,000 subscribers, which is admirable, but, common on the YouTube platform.
Totally.
I think what is completely uncommon on the YouTube platform, and I think you're close to being on your own here, you're not trying to make money from YouTube. You're not trying to, like you said, push a course. You're sharing your own ideas. You're quite honest and candid with your content. And I think that's well received by the audience. But one of the side effects I see is, I think I tweeted about this, but there's going to be a next generation of startup founders who, might not be into Paul Graham's essays because, like you mentioned, video right now is king. They grow up watching your content. You will soon, if you're not already now, it seems like you're on track to kind of have like world-class deal flow because you'll have all these teens and kids at this point growing up watching your content and then, eventually wanting to pitch Initialized. You must have thought about this going into this, correct?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's the best thing we can do is be a good magnet and then pick well and then be good shepherds. That's it. It's like pretty simple job, honestly.
Mm-hmm. Before we wrap up here, I have a couple questions I want to touch on here. Just final questions here. You have incredible startup experience, incredible venture experience, and you're well acquainted with the world of Silicon Valley and startups for that matter. Initialized invests in all sorts of companies, right? You've invested in consumer and B2B. You've had big consumer wins, big B2B wins. You've invested in companies like Cruise and Flexport, and I think that's awesome. But, Instacart, like you mentioned, that was 2012, 2013?
Yeah.
That was a while ago. That's a consumer play. And so I'm curious to hear your thoughts in regards to this idea of the future of consumer, because I've had people on the podcast who feel very strongly about this. And I try to bring this up as much as I can because I like to verse myself in different perspectives here. But there are people who are like, consumers. So there's tons of opportunities, build apps on the App Store. Like it's the golden age is not, behind us. And there are other people who are like, look, the unicorn plus opportunities on the mobile App Store or just in consumer in general are kind of seized by FAANG. And so where do you fall on that spectrum?
Oh, man. Well, you had Blake Robbins on the show, so you probably talked about it with him. Right. I had him on my YouTube channel that's coming up soon. So I'm a big fan of that. Just like what he did with 100 Thieves is incredible. And I think sort of a model, what Jimmy and Mr. Beast are doing. I mean, there are, and it's connected, right? Like people who say FAANG has monopolized consumer are right. But then the greenfield, the sort of area that is yet underbuilt. I was going to say underexploited, and then that would be the wrong word because that's really a terrible way to describe it. Yeah. The underbuilt part, honestly, is still, the creators themselves should get equity and they should be co-founders of this thing. So we've seen actually a good number of, especially consumer e-commerce plays, get to $10 million a year in revenue or tens of millions of dollars in revenue. We have yet to have that many examples of brands that have gotten to 100 million or hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. But I think that's going to happen simply because that's the greenfield. That's the only sort of white space that's allowed by Google and Facebook, because second price auction means that if it's perfect competition for that next incremental user. And so, that's sort of where we're at. Like either a platform shift will happen, maybe it'll be VR, AR, maybe it'll be something else. It might be Neuralink for all we know, and that might be 20 or 30 years out. But, short of a change in the way humans and computers interact, I think creators are sort of the most ripe way to create new emergent behavior. And then gaming, honestly, continues to just evolve, right? Like the rate of change at games is probably slower than it should be because, game creators actually don't have as much access to capital, but this overwhelming amount of capital is coming into the space. So I think it's going to raise all the boats. So, I'm very bullish on esports and gaming. I'm bullish on, the creator economy. And I think hopefully I'll get first row access just by being a creator myself.
Yeah, exactly. So your idea is that, and you're right, I did talk to Blake about this, but your idea is that the creators themselves will be partnering with potentially, technical founders or just starting startups. But do you see this just as an e-commerce? Because like merch has been done, right? So do you see this as an e-commerce play, or are there like consumer products that you see would be in this space?
I mean, the really amazing, interesting thing that could happen is building social networks, entire niche social networks around this stuff, right? Whether it's like the next HQ Trivia, having a community around that sort of live interaction, or, what David's Disposable is, what David Dobrik is doing with that. And then the tricky thing is like, how do you get teams that both understand the tech and have the influencer deeply involved? And, again, Casey Neistat and Matt Hackett are another good example.
Sounds like they just paved the way for this, essentially.
I think it's going to keep happening, and I wouldn't be surprised if that became much, much larger in sort of how we think about consumer. And it makes sense. I mean, I think the biggest innovation that ever happened was having a YouTube account that is like sovereign to a single person. Like all of the power from the megaphone accrues to like one person or one entity. And that never happened before.
Right.
It was like Hollywood was like, it was about distribution. Like music is about payola, right? And so here it's like direct access is probably the most awesome anarchist idea in media.
Yeah. And, ABC News, was vetted by, 10, 20, 30, 100 people. So you mentioned briefly, a potential platform shift. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts in regards to what waves, what trends, what spaces really excite you in the world of startups from a venture perspective in 2020.
I mean, other than creators I think consumer I need to focus on because it's something that we want to continue to be good at. But aside from that, I've been really impressed by the fact that a lot of the world's commerce still does not happen using a computer. And so I think like the next 10 years will still actually be about converting clipboards and file cabinets and fax machines and Excel spreadsheets that are emailed back and forth into, clean data, structured data, dynamic pricing, and then actually intelligent decision-making using that data. And that's going to translate into better, faster, cheaper. And then those things just go and wipe away all the things that weren't using it. And so, what's happening in the public markets with like incumbents having giant compression in their multiples and tech multiples going nuts, I think that's probably too extreme for where we're at in the next 10 years. So I think we've overshot it a little bit right now. But I think it's Bill Gates who says everyone always underestimates what they can do, or they overestimate what they can do in 1 year and underestimate what they can do in 10. So 10 years from now, I think that we'll look back and say, this was a crazy one-time shift. And, not just dozens, but possibly hundreds of billion-dollar companies will be minted. And it will literally be this sort of, it's a cliche, right? It's a cliche for people to say there's going to be a digital revolution. But, if you're this close to the metal and you see the founders, you'll realize like it's a cliche for a reason and it's just taking longer, right? Like people were talking about e-business in like IBM commercials in 1998, but it's just taking longer, but it will still happen. And like, this is actually the generation to do it. And we're seeing it in the food space. Like Instacart taught us that there's Shelf Engine and Silo and all of, we actually, not intentionally ended up funding like the entire ecosystem of like grower to distributor, distributor to grocer, grocer to consumer. And I think that there's virtually every transaction that human beings have with one another will be replaced by, some kind of software-based marketplace that, you or your listeners will make.
Before we head out, Initialized had an office pre-COVID. What is your thought on work from home, just from your perspective?
Oh yeah, I mean, we're probably not going to go back to the office for at least another year, maybe a year and a half. So being fully transparent, we may not go back to the office until 2022. And actually, it's been fine. I mean, we're doing okay. I think productivity-wise, we've actually been doing more.
Right. Interesting. My last question for you. You're a busy guy. Why do you keep your Instagram DMs open? It's very rare.
Well, I think right now it's helping me talk to my customers. I'm doing customer development for my YouTube channel by being as close to the people who have problems as possible. And it's actually just helping me a lot because it just tells me exactly what people need to hear. And it just goes back to my goal. Like my goal is not to make $1. My goal is to increase the velocity of people creating startups and fulfilling their dreams and destinies, which sounds insane when I say it, but that's my life now. So I'm quite thankful for that.
Garry, you've been so generous with your time. I really appreciate your insights.
Thanks for having me, man. There's really great questions and I appreciate your show. Thank you.
That's Garry Tan, one of the ones who succeed. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the show, it would be amazing if you could leave us a review on Apple Podcast. It really helps us out. Or why not tell a friend? That also helps new listeners discover the show. I really appreciate it. If you want to see clips from the show and stay up to date with what I'm working on, you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram. I'm at Campbell J. Barron. You've made it to the end of the show. Thanks for listening. I'm your host, Campbell Barron, and I'll be back in no time.